Afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. According to my clock, it's 12 noon. Welcome to today's Friday noontime question and answer. This is the fourth one that we have done. The other three were on lambing and kidding, lamb and kid management, weaning, and most recently, Ask a Small Ruminant Veterinarian. The one Ask a Vet is already up online on YouTube. We're working on the others. We plan to have videos and fact sheets to go along with each of the question and answers. So today's question and answer is about small ruminant, pasture, and grazing. All of these question and answers are sponsored by 4 universities. My name is Susan Shanian. I'm with the University of Maryland. Dr. Nikki Whitley is with Fort Valley State University. Dr. Kwame Matthews is at Delaware State University, and Dr. Delia O'Brien is at Virginia State University. We received questions at the time of registration, and we're going to ask our experts those questions. You can also ask questions in the chat box. We're going to try to get to everyone's questions. We're going to alternate between our experts. If we don't get to your question, we will include it in the fact sheet. We would like to ask you to refrain from answering any questions. This is the opportunity for the experts to answer the questions. We're focusing on small ruminants, which is sheep, goats, llamas, and alpacas. Let me introduce our 3 experts. You can see their pictures. Jeff Semler. Jeff is a county extension agent in Washington County. That's the county where I work. It's where our research center is. It's where we do research with small ruminants. Jeff has been an integral part of the small ruminant research program over many years. I think we're like our 15th year of doing research there. We did a buck test for many years, and now we have transitioned to sheep research. Jeff's typical county agent, knows kind of everything about everything. His particular area of expertise, however, is forages, is pasture management. So I'm very happy to include Jeff on our panel. In the middle, we have Dr. Amanda Grev. Amanda is been with us, I think, for about 1.5 years. She is our pasture or forage specialist with University of Maryland Extension. She's in the same office as I am. Amanda is from the University of Minnesota. Very pleased to have her as a member of the panel. Our third member is Dr. Gabriel Pent. Gabriel is from Virginia Tech. He is the superintendent of the Shenandoah Valley Research and Extension Center. Some of you may know that as the location of Virginia Tech's RAM test, which is ongoing, he has indicated this year. A lot of other ram and buck tests have been canceled due to COVID-19, but that one is ongoing. Gabriel is a native of Florida and has been with Virginia Tech for several years as a graduate student, as a specialist, and now as superintendent of the research center. The Shenandoah Valley Research and Extension Center is analogous to our Western Maryland Research and Education Center, which is where Amanda and I work and where Jeff is frequently involved as well. So without further ado, we'll get started on the questions. We're going to start out, we got several questions pertaining to toxic plants and weeds. So the first question I'm going to ask Jeff Semler, what are the most dangerous weeds or toxic plants, and how do you identify them?
Okay, well, the most dangerous weed or plant is the one your animal eats and dies from. Now that sounds like a very smart aleck way to answer the question, but quite frankly, most toxic plants animals choose not to eat. Animals in low planes of nutrition will eat toxic plants, but in most cases, they will not eat toxic plants. Depending on where you are in the world, or I guess in the United States, unless there's someone from overseas, then I'm completely at a loss. But most of the time in the United States, and especially in this Great Valley where Gabriel's on one end and I'm kind of in the middle, the plants we look at primarily are going to be in the nightshade family. We're going to look at horse nettle is one of them, but again, very unpalatable. You're going to look at black nightshades, another one. A new invasive is Perilla mint. There's a the Jimson weed is another plant that's toxic. But again, these plants are not plants that are most likely going to be a problem for most pasture managers. I've been in a field where the livestock were standing up to their knees in Perilla mint and they never ate it. It's just the plant, one of its activities, if you will, to ward off being eaten is they're not palatable, they're bitter. Now, there are plants that are typically not toxic, but can go to very toxic. One of those is black cherry. If the limb is broken and the leaves are wilted, only during the wilted period, an animal can go right up to a living black cherry tree, eat the leaves off of it, and nothing will happen. They can eat the brown dead leaves off the ground in the fall, nothing will happen. But wilted leaves have cyanic acid in them and they will kill an animal dead. Think of the gas chamber. That's what we're talking about. Small ruminants, very few leaves are necessary. Larger ruminants, obviously it's going to be another issue. Sorghum, or anybody in the sorghum family, which in a kind of a wild grass or whatever you want to call it, a grass that's loved and hated, Johnson grass, they get what's called prussic acid poisoning, and that's when those plants have been frosted. So they're great during the green season. They're fine after they're brown and dead, but during that period where they've been frosted and wilted, you get into what we call prussic acid poisoning. So again, that's another issue for pasture managers, especially if you've planted a Sudex or sorghum Sudan cross, and to a lesser extent Sudan grass, if it's frosted, you want to stay off of it till it turns brown. If you're grazing millet, you're going to be fine. Millet does not have the toxin. If you're in an area where the neighbor might be a corn farmer or a soybean farmer and you've had Johnson grass escape into your pasture, first off, be happy about that because it's a great forage. But secondly, it can be toxic when it's frosted. So you want to make sure they're not in that paddock or in that cell when that grass is frosted. So that's kind of hitting the high points. There are, again, you'll get the odd animal that will eat a toxic plant because of boredom or whatever you want to talk about. But again, it's going to be a very odd time for that to happen. It's not impossible, and it's also not something that we want to completely negate. But again, you need to look at, I guess, from where you are in the world, what kind of toxic plants are native to your area, and then how much you should worry about. I will say one thing to allay a lot of people's fears, especially those that love monarchs and are worried about milkweed. Western milkweed is toxic, Eastern milkweed is not. There's one of these myths that white sap is always toxic. That's not exactly true in this case. It's not untrue in other cases, but it's not true in the Eastern milkweed. But again, those are some issues that you're going to have to just deal with. I know there's fescue questions, so I'm not going to get into the fescue and that kind of thing, but I hope that answers the questions. I've been seeing some chat roll up here, so I don't know if you're going to ask the questions about the hay or not, but we'll just let it go from there.
So if an animal ate a plant that it shouldn't, somebody wants to know, well, how long till it might show symptoms from eating that plant?
It really will depend on how much it's eaten and what the toxin is, but typically you'll start to see lethargy, perhaps excessive salivation, those kind of things within 24 hours. What you're going to do about it is a whole nother question. And that's why you call your veterinarian. It may be charcoal, it may be some other things, depending on what the toxin is. But typically you're going to see, now that's not the case with the prussic acid, and it's not the case with the cyanic acid from the cherry. Usually the number one indication that you have problems with those two toxins is found dead, because they act very quickly. And I'm not even sure what you could do to counteract those. But the black cherry toxin, when they're wilted leaves, and the prussic acid are very quick acting toxins. But again, I don't know what you could do about it other than manage around it. And a lot of people will ask, well, should I cut down every black cherry tree that I have? That depends on how well you want to sleep at night. If it bothers you, I say cut them all down. If you don't mind walking your pastures after a thunderstorm or a hailstorm or something like that to pick up the broken branches, then there's not a real need for it. You have to manage that. You have to answer those questions yourself. And lastly, black cherry makes a great firewood. So if you've got a wood stove and you don't want to, and you have trouble sleeping at night, cut it down, split it up, stack it up, and heat yourself in the wintertime.
Jeff introduced the subject of fescue. How suitable is fescue as a forage for small ruminants, or as specifically grazing it? Does it cause some of the same problems, for example, that it causes with horses, which is reproductive issues, and with cattle as well? Amanda, you want to address the topic of fescue for small ruminants?
Sure. I'll start us off on the fescue discussion. So when it comes to fescue, the first thing to consider is the type of fescue, because there are several different types or varieties that are available. The old traditional type, that's not kind of the newer, more improved varieties, would be what would be commonly referred to as the toxic fescue or endophyte infected fescue. This would be varieties like Kentucky 31 and things that have been kind of around for a long time. In the last, in recent years, they have developed varieties that are endophyte-free varieties of fescue, which contain no endophyte in them whatsoever. And then more recently, they have developed novel endophyte varieties of fescue, which contain a different type of endophyte that is not the toxic one that is found in the traditional Kentucky 31. So if you have a fescue variety that's endophyte-free or novel endophyte, that alleviates your concerns with fescue toxicity. If you have one of the Kentucky 31 type fescues that are the toxic type, that's when you come into more of those problems. There is a little bit less known about the issues with sheep and goats and small ruminants than there are with cattle or horses. Horses are known for the reproductive issues. Cattle are known for things like reduced weight gain, vasoconstriction, poor growth, poor coat health, etc. I do know that there are a couple of studies that have found some reduced weight gain with sheep. They did note that they seem to be less affected than cattle, but they did find some instances of reduced weight gain for sheep. They also anecdotally have found some evidence of problems with sheep and goats, but honestly there just hasn't been a lot of research looking into these issues with sheep and goats. So and that it kind of remains to be seen a little bit, but it's something to be aware of and to use caution if you are doing a lot of breeding or raising animals on pasture that's probably the endophyte infected type.
Thank you. So Gabriel, would the typical clover fescue pasture be suitable for sheep, goats, and camelids? Or would you plant something different if you were starting from scratch?
That's a good question. Amanda touched on this a little bit, but tall fescue is you can have different endophytes within the tall fescue. So there's the novel endophytes, which have a new and improved endophyte that still helps the grass persist through stress and drought, but doesn't produce the negative outcomes on livestock that we've seen, particularly with cattle. So it's the same species. If you're concerned at all about tall fescue toxicosis in small ruminants, then I'd highly recommend a novel endophyte variety. The endophyte varieties or endophyte-free varieties are not toxic to livestock in general, but without that endophyte, they just don't survive through a lot of the stress and drought that we see, at least further south here, down in central Virginia. So yes, tall fescue and clover can be great species, but I would have some reservations about establishing Kentucky 31 or a toxic endophyte infected tall fescue, even with the lack of research that we have, at least with goats anyway. But other species are good. I'm always a fan of diverse pasture mixes. Provide some room for buffering against environmental extremes, but also some selection for livestock to select different species. So other cool season grasses would be appropriate, such as orchard grass, bluegrass, maybe some smooth brome, depending on where you're at. So yeah, I think those are good species to consider and mix together. And clover certainly is excellent from a perspective of trying to improve intake by your ruminants, which highly prefer those clovers.
Amanda, there was a number of questions about how do you decide how big a pasture should be? How do you, basically, we're talking about how do you design a grazing system? How do you figure all that stuff out?
Yeah, so there are a lot of factors that go into determining the size of a pasture. Really, in order to do it appropriately, you need to know and evaluate a number of different things. This would be including things like what type of forage you have growing in that pasture, how productive that forage is, or how much it produces per year. And if that fluctuates during, periods of the year when it's growing rapidly, like in the spring or fall with our traditional cool season forages, or if it's during the summertime when it's growing a little bit more slowly. And then it also depends on your management system, how you manage your grazing animals, whether that's with a continuous grazing system where the animals have access to the entire field, or a rotational grazing system where those animals are rotated through those different pastures. And then it also depends on the animal's intake level. So, for a small ruminant, like your average ewe or sheep, I would say that, you have to consider how much of their percent body weight they consume on average. So if you're looking for kind of some really rough guidelines, you can think about it in terms of an animal unit equivalent, which basically means one animal unit is 1,000 pound average, mature cow that's at maintenance, or mature horse that's at maintenance. So for sheep, they would be more of since they're obviously smaller and they weigh less than 1,000 pounds, it's more like 5 ewes makes up one animal unit. The typical average traditional cool season perennial pastures can in general hold like half of an animal unit per acre per year, which comes up to a stocking rate of maybe 2 to 3 ewes per acre. Of course, that will depend on your management and how productive your forage is and all those other factors. So if you're managing it really well and your forages are growing really well and you're using highly productive species, you can get a little bit higher stocking rate. And if you're, not investing as much management into it or not doing as much renovation or upkeep, then that stocking rate is going to have to be a little bit lower. So it's always a flexible system, and you always have to think about making those adjustments based on how things are going.
Thank you, Amanda. Jeff, you and I did a buck test for 11 years. We learned a lot about how goats graze or browse. They are browsers. What would you recommend to a goat producer in terms of what he or she should plant?
Well, I mean, high growing forage is always the best option. You can make them graze as we did, but certainly depending on where you're at, because if we got anybody listening from Kansas, they're going to really not be happy about this. But Sericea lespedeza is one of those plants that they'll browse. We've never had great success here at the Western Maryland Research and Education Center of getting it established. But certainly, that's one of the plants. As far as what to plant, I would handle a pasture like a pasture and mix cool season grasses. If you have the ability, I would certainly recommend warm season grasses because, again, goats like to browse, so they'll browse the millet because they get to keep their heads up. They'll browse sunflowers. We had sun hemp, mare's tail, which I realized we didn't plant. So they'll do a good job of browsing when given the choice. As far as in that grass, anything you can grow or plant in there is going to be higher profile. Certainly Ladino clover is going to be more erect. Some of the more erect red clovers are going to be, again, something that's going to stick up. Those would be certainly for perennial pastures something to think about. But in annual pastures, your warm season grasses that don't grow too high. That's why I said millet and I didn't say Sudan grass or anything like that, because what happened to us a few years ago is, remember, goats are prey species. So they like to be able to see things. And our tech got the wrong kind of millet, and it was not dwarf millet. And we had to mow paths through that millet to get the goats to go in it. They would not go in it. It was planted on 7.5-inch rows, and they would only browse the outside. So we mowed alleys in that millet in order to get forage utilization. Not exactly what I wanted to do, but it was something we had to do. The other thing are brassicas. So anything in the turnip family, you want to think about it, rape, those are other good forages. We've used some forage chicory. That grows above what I would consider the normal height of cool season grasses. You can put chicory, you can put some of the other brassicas, you can drill them right into your cool season pastures if you choose to. Depending on how thick and dense your sward is will depend on how great a job you get as far as the germination and so on, but those are some of the options that you have.
Jeff mentioned taller growing forages for goats, and there's two reasons for that. One, they are a top-down grazer, they're a browser, but that also helps them with parasites. Most of the worm larva is in the first few inches of vegetation. So the more you keep that goat's head off the ground, the more you're going to be able to control that problem. Gabriel, what's the best summer pasture for not just small ruminants, I guess we're speaking in general. What makes the best summer pasture?
Yeah, so I guess what you're probably getting at there is that these cool season grasses grow, most of their production occurs in the spring in our area, and then there's some more production in the fall. And so there's what we might call a summer slump period where grass production seems to go down, or the forages just are mature and not all that nutritious to the animals and not very palatable. So Jeff already mentioned some are annuals. Some of the grasses, including the dwarf pearl millets, are a good choice for summer grazing. Annuals, of course, are expensive, so that can be prohibitive for some folks, just the risk and the expense of establishing forages year after year. There are some native grasses. I might defer to Jeff or others on speaking to those. I know there's some photosensitivity issues with small ruminants on native grasses. Jeff, you want to comment on any of that?
Yeah, so some of the, when Gabriel's talking about the natives, we're talking about things like little and big blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, and so on and so forth. Again, some of those do have some issues with photosensitivity. think here, you know, it's why you don't go out in the sunshine after taking an antibiotic without sunscreen. So that's what we're talking about with photosensitivity, is the ingestion. There's some chemicals in those plants that will cause some photosensitivity to the livestock. But again, it's a solution, as Susan already, I guess, quoted me. Dilution's a solution for pollution. So if you've got a smorgasbord, you can plant some clovers in amongst some of those warm season perennial grasses that I mentioned, and there's more than just those. I just gave you some suggestions or some options. The biggest downside I've found with warm season annual grasses is time of establishment. Most of us are not swimming in land. So when you have to take a section of your pasture out of production for probably at least a year, that causes problems. At least it would for me. I mean, I'm not swimming in pasture land. If I was, I would definitely love to establish some warm season perennial grasses. I should tell you right off, I'm a beef producer, so sorry about that. But I think they have a place in all ruminant nutrition or all ruminant pasturing. But the problem for me has always been the length of time it takes to get those established, and the fact that I'm moving animals across, and I'm sure you are too, moving animals across a fixed land base. And if you had more land, you would probably be like me and you would have more animals. You wouldn't take the time to rest out or to take land out of production and put it into something else.
Amanda, could you go through the steps for establishing a new pasture?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to pasture renovation, there's kind of a series of steps that's recommended to follow. One of the first things that you need to do is get your soil fertility to an adjusted or an appropriate level. So doing a little bit of soil sampling, having a soil test done, and applying whatever nutrients are lacking, making sure that you have an appropriate pH so that your soil is not too acidic, and that those nutrients can be appropriately taken up by the plants as they are needed. Along with that, you also have some prep work in making sure that your weeds are under control. So if there's a lot of weeds that you're dealing with, getting those under control before you get a new stand planted will be really helpful in the long run, and will help that new stand get off to kind of a better start or a faster start. Once you have those things under control, the next step is to kind of minimize whatever existing forage or vegetation is there. There's a few different ways you can do that. It can include, if you're planning on planting with a no-till drill, it can be just some sort of herbicide or burn down to suppress that existing vegetation. You can use your livestock to graze that existing vegetation really, really tightly down to the ground. You can use a mower and clip everything very close to the ground. Or if you're planting conventionally and you're going to use some tillage, you can till that soil and make a nice even seed bed. Basically what you want to, the goal of all of that is to prepare the seed bed in a way that there's not going to be existing forages competing with what you're trying to plant, whether that be tilled or not tilled. Then once it comes time to plant, of course, there are things like making sure that we plant at the right time of year. When we're thinking about most of our cool season perennial forages, the best time to plant usually is in the fall. As the days are getting cooler, there's a little bit less weed pressure, there's usually more moisture around, although there was a few problems with that last fall. But in general, the fall is the best time. Second best time would be early in the spring before things really heat up for the summer and while there's still adequate moisture. Other considerations include making sure that you have appropriate seeding rate and that you're putting that seed down at the that the best seeding rate for whatever that seed may be. Seeds come in all shapes and sizes. You also want to make sure that your seed drill is calibrated so that it's applying that seed at that correct rate, and also applying that seed at the correct depth. Planting a lot of our forage seeds a little bit too deep really hurts their emergence and will hurt that, that new stand a lot more than you might think. So making sure that we're putting things at the right rate and the right depth so that it can get off to a good start is really important. Then the last thing is, once that seed has started to grow, we want to make sure that we're managing it well so that our livestock aren't you know, going in and tearing it up right away. So usually we recommend letting that seed kind of, or letting that new forage or new vegetation grow up to, you know, maybe a 8 to 10 inch height, actually mowing it off once to really get those plants to kind of set down roots and minimize the impact of the livestock from pulling those plants up, and then letting it regrow. If you plant in the fall, that might be not until the following spring. If you plant in the spring, it might be, of course, once things are ready to go. That's kind of the broad overview.
Is there a best source for seed?
I would say the best source is a reputable source and seed that has been certified so that it's weed-free and guaranteed, you know, with a certain % germination.
Is it better to plant a pasture mix or to select specific species?
That kind of depends on how you want to manage things. There's a couple of different strategies. Some people like to plant a mix right away, which works just fine and can come up quite nicely. There are other people who prefer to plant, especially if their eventual goal is to have a mix of, you know, different things like grasses, legumes, forbs, etc. They might start with just the grasses. That gives them a little bit more weed control right off the get-go. So if there are a lot of weed issues, they have a lot more options and herbicides that are available for getting those weeds under control while the grasses get established, and then coming in later and either overseeding or frost seeding in some legumes, some clover, or, you know, other things as needed. So it kind of depends on how you want to go about it.
Thank you. One of the challenges in setting up a rotational grazing system is providing shade or shelter for the livestock. Gabriel, can you address that topic?
Sorry, say again, this was the shade question?
Yeah, it's always a challenge making sure the animals have access to shade or shelter in the paddocks.
Sure. Well, a few thoughts. So I know the question has been centered a little bit around allowing animals access to shade and then traveling to get to it and then just hanging out at the shade for a long time. So that can create issues with them just spending all the time in the shade. Intake may go down, or you might have a vector area for disease with too much pressure on one given area. So rotational stocking can help, but what do you do when you only have one shade source that may or may not be portable? So there's several issues or several ways to provide portable shade. Of course, some of them are harder or more expensive, at least when you're scaling it up. There's more options, I think, available for smaller operations. I've seen many different types of artificial shade provided. Barns, carports. Some carports may be created to be somewhat mobile. Some folks will buy and utilize poly domes or huts. I've seen some homemade shelters made out of old hay rings that have been cut in half, or with some shade cloth on it. Of course, those kinds of shelters can be difficult to maintain, and it takes a little bit of creativity to make them so they're truly mobile. Otherwise, you just get the same issue of them pugging up or muddying a single spot over and over again. Some of my research as a graduate student was on silvopasture, which is integration of trees in the pastures. So I want to be clear that silvopasture is not just having a single tree or just a couple trees in the pasture, where a pasture that's continuously stocked, where they have constant access to that same tree. because you do get those issues of just defoliation and wallowing around that tree, as well as potential debarking, which results in eventually a dead tree. So silvopasture is a lot more intentional and intensive than that. It almost by nature has to involve some sort of rotational stocking so that animals aren't constantly allowed access to the same trees. So moving across the landscape, it involves a distributed shade. So more than just one or a couple trees, but it can have, as I saw in my research, some very helpful benefits to both animal welfare and also the productivity of the land, because in some cases the trees can provide some additional products, including some browse in some cases to the sheep. So silvopasture isn't for everyone, but it can be a way to provide shade to livestock when it's managed appropriately.
Somewhat related to silvopasture is just kind of the general concept of having a browse area for goats. So Jeff, if a farm has an area that we would kind of classify as browse, what exactly do we mean by that, and how would we manage that resource different than, say, a pasture that's planted in orchard grass and clover?
Well, if you want to think about, each farmstead may have an area that's a browse area. The browse areas have to be managed as well, or the goat eats themselves out of a job. So think about an understory, maybe in a woodlot, or maybe you've got some timber plantings, for instance, black walnut or red oak or whatever it might be. The goat is going to mimic what the white-tailed deer does. So they're going to go under that, in that understory, and they're going to basically, as high as they can get, they're going to browse leaves off of plants. And so but the trick to managing that is, if you overgraze under there, you'll go to any national park or state park and look where deer are not pushed, i.e. hunted, and you can see a browse line. You can look down through the woods, and you can see exactly how high the deer have browsed, and they eat their way out of their own job. So you have to manage those areas with goats just like you would manage a pasture. Now, if you want to clear land, that's completely different. Put them in there, let them eat that understory, open that up, and that's, again, a completely different situation. But as far as those kind of that kind of browsing goes, that's what I would recommend. Out in a regular pasture, there would be some opportunity if one really had the time and really wanted to. You could, basically Google some space in England and look at their hedgerows, and you could plant and make hedgerows and allow the goats to graze those hedgerows, or I should say browse those hedgerows. Those hedgerows have taken, in some cases, decades, if not hundreds of years to establish. So this is not something for the faint of heart, and not something that's going to basically happen overnight. But if you've inherited a property, and I've seen some questions about people that are gotten a property that they didn't know nothing about, or they, whatever, it wasn't handed to them from grandpa or whatever, those kind of things. You've probably got some old fence rows, and you've got the opportunity to use those as browse areas for your goats, certainly. And again, goats aren't the only thing to browse, but they are certainly the species we're talking about now. Sheep will do some browsing as well, but certainly that's a place to start. But you got to be careful, or the goat will eat itself out of a job.
Thanks, Jeff. We always get several people on these webinars that have llamas and alpacas. Amanda, when we talk about pasture and grazing management, would you approach it any differently for a llama or an alpaca?
So when it comes to grazing management, for the most part, the things that we're going to do to promote good grazing management will be similar concepts across most of our livestock species. So this will include things like making sure that we're not overgrazing, leaving enough residual forage so that those forages have leaf area that will allow them to continue to photosynthesize and regrow a lot quicker and stay much healthier when they're trying to regrow. Proper soil fertility, proper weed control, using that rotational grazing so that the forages have a time to rest in between grazing bouts. And just making sure that we're kind of doing all of the good maintenance and upkeep that we need to be doing. I'm not super familiar with llamas and alpacas specifically, but I would say that all of these, kind of general good grazing management principles, would apply to them just as equally as it would apply to a sheep or a cow or a horse or anything.
Gabriel, if someone wanted to plant some trees on the property in their pastures to provide some shade and for other reasons too, what would you recommend? Or do you have any recommendations for planting trees? And I'm sure it might vary somewhat by geographic location.
Sure, that's a pretty important consideration. So I would, if you're interested in this, I would certainly talk to a forester or somebody in extension who's got some knowledge of tree species that are suitable for your area. That probably would be one of the most, if not the most important consideration, is what trees will not just survive in your area, but survive over a long period of time. Other considerations that I would think about would be marketability. Do you have another plan for those trees beyond just shade for your sheep or your goats? There may be some options there in terms of timber or non-timber products. Also consider the growth pattern, the rate, the morphology of the tree. Does it have a deep taproot, or does it mostly have roots that are close to the surface and thereby would compete with your forage plants for resources? Another important consideration is its phenology, which is basically morphology over time. So I've worked a lot with black walnut and honey locust. Both of these tree species leaf out relatively late in the spring, and then they lose their leaves relatively early, at least compared to something like an oak. They lose their leaves relatively early in the fall. And so this reduces competition for light when our cool season grasses are most productive in the spring and in the fall time. So there's some complementarity there, but for those particular species. Other species that I know people have used and has worked well for them, particularly as a browse for small ruminants, is black locust. Now, black locust does have some pretty nasty thorns, and so I would say that it takes some special consideration before you release black locust onto a pasture about how you're going to manage those thorns. Honey locust is similar, but in my experience, sheep defoliate honey locust so quickly with proper management that it doesn't ever produce appreciable thorns. There's also some thornless varieties of honey locust. In some regions, pines might be a suitable shade species for small ruminants, although I know further south there's been reports of serious debarking of some pine species. But other hardwood species might include yellow poplar, mulberry, persimmon, or pecan. Again, those are largely dependent on, their suitability is largely dependent on where you're at.
Are there species to avoid?
Well, I would avoid species that are going to produce heavy amounts of shade for most of the growing season. So you might think of something like American beech as a species to avoid. Oaks may have some utilization, but they can create some pretty deep shade. And so I'd be hesitant to use much oak. You also have some issues related to acorns. If you have too many acorns overwhelming the goats at any moment in time. And then certainly, as Jeff mentioned, the toxicity potential of anything in the cherry family, essentially. There is some risk, as he mentioned, associated with having those in the pasture system.
We think of trees as providing shade, and you mentioned they can be an income source. But aren't we learning increasingly that they can have other benefits in the pasture system, like your silvopasture? Should we be incorporating trees into our pasture systems more?
Sure, yeah. So there's the benefits, of course, to the animals in terms of shade and some comfort, some mitigation from environmental stress. But there's also some conservation services or environmental ecosystem services that trees can provide. And it can be varied. Soil conservation, just from having different root systems in the ground, tree root systems and forage root systems together. There's some evidence that it can increase carbon sequestration and land productivity, and so certainly that has a benefit from an air quality and carbon standpoint. And also some better utilization of nutrients and maybe some evidence that there's less nutrient loss from the system in a silvopasture system. There's also some aesthetic value to it as well. A lot of people enjoy that open savanna sort of look of silvopasture systems. So there's some social benefits that may be realized through silvopasture as well.
What about fruit trees?
Fruit trees can be used. It may take a higher level of management. Some of the fruits are thin bark, and so there can be an issue with debarking by small ruminants or girdling. So you may want to consider some sort of tree protection. Certainly rotational stocking will be a must to monitor that kind of behavior. Also, if you're planning to harvest the fruit, there's some requirements related to removing animals from that land. If you're harvesting fruits or nuts off the ground anyway, of having animals out of those pastures for a certain interval of time prior to harvest. So yeah, that can be done, but it requires a higher level of management if you're planning to harvest fruits or nuts from that area.
Thank you. We get a number of questions about parasites. Obviously, when we talk about grazing small ruminants, parasites are a risk. I'm going to ask Dr. Whitley to address the issue of parasites. How do you stay ahead of the problem? How quickly should you rotate animals? How long should you rest the pasture before bringing them back?
All right, so pasture management for parasite control. We had a seminar on that, and the video is available at wormex.info/videos/webinar or -webinar, I think, but it's wormex.info. So generally, if we're doing rotational grazing, we want to be able to rotate in our pasture management fact sheet at wormex.info. We say every 1 to 3 days. And the reason behind that is that the larva can escape the feces and infect the pasture in 4 to 5 days. So you want to move them before the larvae come out and infect the pasture. The larva from the poop that they deposit on that pasture. So that's assuming that pasture hasn't had animals for, we say, 60 days in the summer, maybe a little longer in the cooler season. The parasites can live longer. The infective stage of that larva can live longer on the pasture in the cool season than it can in the hot summer months. So we want to try to leave them off the pasture for at least 60 days and rotate every 1 to 3 days if possible. Now, a lot of people, Jeff mentioned this, you don't have enough land to be able to do that. So we tell people maybe try to manage it based on plant height. So we want to manage plant height so that it's over 4 to 6 inches, because most of the larvae in the lower 2 to 4 inches, especially that first 2 inches of the forage. Now we also want to balance that for nutrition, because as our forages mature, their nutritional content will decrease. So you can also use multi-species grazing with horses and with some cattle to help clean up our pastures. We can make sure we use our cleanest pastures with our more susceptible animals, which are young growing animals, especially around the time of weaning, and our paraparturient females, which are right before up to especially peak lactation, but during lactation as well. Those are more susceptible to parasites. We can use our cleanest pastures for those, with those clean pastures being ones that are new, like annuals, ones that are perennials that have been recently planted, haven't had animals on them for a while. Ones that may have been burned off during the dormant season for that forage. And those that may have had different species on them for enough time to vacuum those pastures, like a horse pasture. So if the horse has eaten the pasture down and vacuum those worms off and you let that pasture grow back, that's a fairly clean pasture. If you're looking at just resting a pasture, the larvae can live on that pasture for 6 months to a year. That's drastic. Again, usually 2 to 3 months in the summer, and 3 to 4 months in the cooler season is plenty of time to be cleaner. So different things you can do. There's bioworma, feeding bioworma to clean up our pastures. We have also a webinar video at the wormex.info video links that discusses the use of bioworma and how that helps to clean up pastures as well. Did I miss anything?
That was a good overview. Thank you, Nikki. Some of the people that participate in these webinars don't have very many animals. One person says they have 2 sheep, 2 goats, and 1 acre of pasture. Part of the pasture is very wet, and another part of the pasture has a lot of bedding on it. Amanda, suggestions for managing these very small holdings that have these problems in specific parts of their pasture. So part is very wet and part has a lot of bedding on it, and just a couple of animals, 1 acre.
Yeah, so the problem we run into when we have smaller acreages and more animals or livestock on those acreages is that's when we run into a lot of issues with things being overgrazed. The ability of our pastures is not necessarily able to keep up with the stocking rate that we have on that field. So that's when things like different management strategies become really essential. There are a number of different options. If you aren't already, using a rotational grazing system will help not only improve the productivity of that forage, but also increase the stocking rate that pasture will be able to maintain, because those pastures will be getting a rest period. Using other things like a dry lot or a sacrifice lot to keep the livestock out of the field at times of the year when it's not ready to be grazed is another opportunity. There's a lot of different ways that you can set up your layout. You can have a centrally located dry lot or sacrifice lot. You can have one that's on one end and have a lane leading out to different pastures or fields. There's a lot of different ways to kind of set that up, but really when we have that small acreage and that high number of animals, it's really important that we're not overgrazing those fields. When we do start to get into an overgraze situation, that's when we see a lot of issues with our weeds popping up. Those pastures are not able, or those grasses that we want to keep there are not able to keep up with the constant demand or constant grazing pressure. And a lot of our weed species are very opportunistic, and they will start to infiltrate and come in and grow and thrive in those empty areas or bare areas. Another thing to consider is choosing a forage species that is appropriate to your site. So if you have more sandy soil or other soil types, there are different forages that grow better or worse on those different soil types. Same thing for topography or slope. Same thing for soil that is more poorly drained versus one that's really well drained. So choosing something that will withstand a little bit of that grazing pressure and hold up to whatever your site conditions are will also help with maximizing the availability or the productivity from that smaller area.
Thanks, Amanda. Just about 1 o'clock. I'm going to give Jeff the last opportunity. The 3 most important things to manage pasture for small ruminants or livestock in general.
Kind of like, you've heard the saying in real estate, location, location, location. In pasture management, you could say rotation, 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 or rest. That I think is the most important thing. Overgrazing is your biggest nemesis. And I think that's the where we really start to fall down is we see a little grass out there and we want to turn our animals on it. You have to remember that if you're doing what we would call continuous grazing, if you want to think about it in a really extreme manner, is take your lawnmower out and mow your grass today. Tomorrow, set it down another setting and mow it. The next day, set it down another setting and mow it. The next day, set it down another setting and mow it. If you don't have a set lower, get out your string trimmer. That's what the animal's doing. They are taking all the candy off that field, and they're going to graze as close as you can. Now, they're going to refuse some things, so you can see that. Anybody that's managed pasture, you see those big green clumps out there that nobody eats. Dollars to donuts, and I get a lot of donuts this way. It's Kentucky 31 fescue because they're not going to eat it. And they'll just as soon starve to death as eat it. So for me, if there's nothing you can do, even if it has to be a sacrifice lot and you're going to feed hay, resting that pasture is the key to forage management. If I can really quickly answer one of the chat questions, as far as rotational grazing goes, square is better than any other shape when it comes to forage utilization of pastures. So long, narrow pastures or pie shape or whatever you want to call it. The problem is those animals come back to water or mineral, and they come back over that forage, and so they're going to graze regrowth if you're not moving them fast enough, and they're not going to go all the way out to the end of that paddock and utilize that forage unless you're going to use brake wires, and that is another webinar.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you to Jeff for being one of our panelists today. Thanks to Amanda Grev and Gabriel Pent.